give after.
Cool.
All right, lovely. Thanks both. I'll let everybody in now. Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. We're just waiting for the last guest to come in from the waiting room. Wonderful. So yeah, thank you all so much for joining us this evening. I would like to begin by first acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I currently am, the Wangaratta and Turrbal people. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I'd like to acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So it is my absolute pleasure to be here with you all this evening for tonight's discussion of Mark Mordue's Boy on Fire. Before I hand you over to tonight's speakers, I'd just like to really quickly reiterate some of the information that I mentioned in the email you were sent earlier with your link to join tonight's event. So as you're all aware, you have been placed automatically on mute and you'll remain so throughout the evening, but that doesn't mean that Mark doesn't want to answer your questions. He has assured me that he does. The Q&A might just look a little bit different to what you're familiar with if you haven't come along to one of our events before. If you have, then you'll know that we use the chat box to take questions. All of your questions will come straight through to me when you type them there, and then I'll read them out for Mark to answer during the last 10 or 15 minutes or so of tonight's event. So if you can't see that chat box, it should be towards the lower left of your screen. And if you still can't find it, then don't worry. I'm going to be using the chat box to purchase, to pop the link that you can use to purchase your copies of Boy on Fire if you haven't already done so through us at Avid Reader. So I'll share that link there for you shortly, and that's the space that you can use to type your questions and send them to me. And so it is now my pleasure to introduce Mark Mordue. Mark is an Australian writer, journalist and editor. He is a co-winner of the 2014 Peter Blasey Fellowship, which recognises an outstanding manuscript in the fields of biography, autobiography or life writing, and is also the author of Dustag, Diary of a Head Trip, which was shortlisted for the 2002 Qantas City of Brisbane Asia Pacific Travel Writing Prize. His work has been published in Interview, Madison, Speak, The Nation and Salon, as well as Rolling Stone, Vogue, GQ, The Australian and the Sydney Morning Herald. Mark was the winner of a 1992 Human Rights Media Award and the 2010 Pascal Prize for Critical Writing. From 1992 to 1997, he was the founding editor of Australia's leading pop culture magazine, Australian Style. His poetry, fiction, essays and memoir work have appeared in literary journals such as Heat, Meanjin, Griffith Review and Overland in Australia. In conversation with Mark tonight, we have Dr. Felicity Plunkett. Felicity is an award-winning poet and critic living on Gadigal land. Her new poetry collection is A Kinder Sea, published by UQP. She holds Australian Book Review's Patrons Fellowship, and her essay on Nick Cave, A Mutinous and Ferocious Grace, Nick Cave and Trauma's Aftermath, was published in Australian Book Review and Australian Financial Review. And so, Mark and Felicity, it's now my pleasure to hand over to you both for tonight's discussion.
All right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma Kate. So I think I'm just going to start by making some comments. And first of all, I'd just like to say, Emma Kate, thank you so much to Avid for hosting this event. I sort of feel, having lived in Brisbane for a few years, I still feel a bit like an honorary Avid local. And the last live event I attended this year was my own book launch, which was at Avid Reader in February, a real live book launch. And it was an incredibly beautiful night hosted by the wonderful Chrissy Neen. So I just want to say thanks to you and to Avid for all of the work that you've done over 2020. For those of us who've had a book out, it's been a very strange year, and I feel as though programs like Avid's have really made it something really special. And it's also allowed us to kind of zip interstate much more often than we would otherwise do and have audiences that we wouldn't otherwise have. So I think it's a pretty wonderful thing. I would like to begin, though, by respectfully acknowledging that I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and paying my respects to elders past and present. Well, it's a joy to be here talking with Mark about Boy on Fire. And I thought it would be just good, I just wanted to start by expressing my sense that just really grew as I was reading this book of what a huge achievement it is. It is quite extraordinary in scope and it's meticulously detailed. Just on Mark's work a little bit more to put Boy on Fire in context. Mark is a legendary journalist, editor and writer, and among other prizes, he won the 2010 Pascal Prize for Critical Writing. And much of this critical writing is about music. And some of my favourite pieces of this are about Nick Cave. I think that to be a working freelance writer takes a lot of grit, and I have a lot of respect for the quality of Mark's writing, which never seems to dip. One of the pieces about Nick Cave is a really extraordinary 2017 interview. Much of it, as I gather, was conducted in a car travelling between Newcastle and Sydney. And as far as I know, it's really the only interview where Nick Cave speaks about that important question of creativity after trauma in a very open kind of way. And he ends with a comment, the piece ends with a comment about songs, sort of the idea that songs have a life of their own. And Nick Cave says, the songs are strange things, you know, they're patient and wait for the meaning, and then meaning changes through the years. And this comment, which I think is really, really interesting one, came back to me as I read Boy on Fire. It seems to me that this book has been created with the most incredible, painstaking attention over many years. So first up, Mark, big congratulations formally in this content. And I think it's obviously a must for Cave fans, but it's also really fascinating in terms of the whole musical context that you depict. And also, I think, in terms of how you might go about writing a biography, which I think might be a really difficult thing. So to distill some questions down from that, these, I guess, are some of the questions that I had as I've been reading it. And the first really big question is, how did you do this? And I'll put that in some layers simply. First of all, the practical dimension. There must have been an incredible number of interviews. So I think that the collection and the assemblage of such a wide range of witnesses, participants, all with their various takes and their various investments on things, just the sheer slog of doing so much careful research and interviewing. And I thought it'd be great just to ask you, can you tell us how you organised all of this material and what it took to get that material? So the writing process, in short.
Okay. Well, I mean, to tell the truth, I think I overwhelmed myself, right? I dove into it intensely. The original nature of the project was a full life of Nick Cave, so there were a hell of a lot more interviews as well. I travelled to Wangaratta, which was where Nick grew up. He was born in Warwick-Nabil, and I did a lot of research about that as well. I did many trips to Melbourne. I spoke to his peer group and musicians of the time. I read voraciously. I travelled to the UK and interviewed Nick in Brighton. I spoke to people in London. I travelled to Berlin. I was planning to try and get to Sao Paulo as well. By that stage, I just had sort of drowned myself in research and interviews, and I had, I don't know that I looking back, I don't think I had too much, but the scope of what I wanted to do was literally on a kind of Moby Dick. Milton's Paradise Lost was a model that I had in mind as a kind of sub-model for the book. And those ideas were good, but they required a kind of, I'd need to live 3 lives to achieve the vision that I'd set for myself. And, you know, I basically sort of collapsed under the weight of all that. But steadily, even at that stage when the project seemed ready to go south, I was kind of it's like, you know, writing on a big project is a form of sculpture. You know, you've got like a mountain, and you're just shaving away, and you're finding the important pieces and putting them together, and then of course taking them apart again and putting them back together with something new. And you're pattern seeking, and pattern seeking is something that has always interested me as a writer, and I think it's a key ingredient for anybody who wants to be good, not just the details and not just the great quotes, both of which matter, and the accuracy, which is certainly important to me from a journalistic point of view, and the storytelling, which gives it energy, but this sense that it has a meaning, and the meaning in nonfiction is in the pattern making and in recognizing connections that can be quite distant or quite subtle between images and information, between incidents and emotions, these kind of things. So it's a kind of, in a way, sort of perhaps painterly in its sensibilities, but you're trying all the time to sort of create these kind of unities. And that helps because you know you want it. And when you're feeling lost, you're pushing all the time to get the best palette that you can up in front of you and visible from a kind of writing kind of point of view. But yeah, it was very, very difficult. You know, as I say, I kind of sort of collapsed out of the project. There was a kind of few lost years with it. Then I returned to it, and it was a very intense kind of focusing this year. And I knew that I wanted to do a portrait of the artist as a young man, because I knew that a lot of the things that happened in Nick's youth were resonant throughout his life and resonant throughout his work and referenced in his work. And that's a thing that I think we can all understand. We all look towards our childhood and teenage years for the things that are magical, for our kind of dreams to sort of restore us, and trauma as well, you know, the things that have hurt us and why we're repeating certain patterns or obsessions, you know, particularly if you're an artist. So I knew that time was a key, and that I could kind of find a specific zone of time to hold a much larger sphere of information in. And also, of course, that meant I could pare down and not get so lost like I had been trying to do the whole life, and kind of create a step that I could walk up into Nick's story, because he's such an incredible artist. It's not just his life, which is very big, but also the sophistication of his references. You know, whether we're talking about Alice Cooper, or whether we're talking about Goya, or whether we're talking about elements of philosophy, or, you know, whatever it might be, there's so much there. So, you know, that focus pulling thing was important too. I mean, I'm pretty sort of old school, perhaps even antique in my kind of approaches. I did actually physically record the interviews, but I don't actually use recordings. I just use notebooks. The notebooks help in the sense that I don't have endless reams of transcript. I have sort of a kind of focused transcript visibly before me, what I've captured. So that was one thing that was an asset in my favour, in terms of not getting entirely lost in kind of 10,000 pages worth of material. Like maybe I had 1,000 instead, if you want to kind of use those kind of exaggerated random numbers, but it's not too exaggerated. I don't know, I think after a while you realise you can't put everything in either, and so that starts to, you hew towards your obsessions, and obsessiveness, which sort of almost destroyed me really, also became the thing that kind of saved me, because there were things that I definitely was attracted towards.
Yeah, and I guess in Nick Cave's case, because he's not showing any signs of slowing down, or, you know, he's continually reinventing himself and working in new forms and so on. So it's not really a biography that, you know, his creative life is still so vital. So yeah, I think it's a really wise decision to do it this way. I guess the other question around biography is about that question, especially when you're dealing with somebody who is who has had that big life, and people sort of have their various takes on Nick Cave. And I guess the people involved too seem to have quite strong opinions about how they remember things and so on. So I think that question of the different competing accounts, different memories, the forgetting process. And then, of course, on top of that, you have an artist like Nick Cave who is continually reimagining parts of his history. And as you say, also casting off certain parts of his history along the way in a very artful way. So I wonder how you make sense of it when you have those, competing kind of accounts of particular events.
That's the thrill of it, right? Because the competing versions are what keeps the story alive. You don't need to pin Nick like a butterfly to a board. You don't need to give history an absolute answer. Yeah. Like a great historical work, and I wanted this to be historical and social and cultural in terms of what I mapped as much as a biography of Nick on as a personality and an artist in his own right. I wanted to map everyone around him. I wanted to map the landscapes, the times. It's an asset to have those contradictions and for lapses of information and gaps that are filled by other people whose accounts are, I would think you would also see, of course, that certain people or aspects to certain people's stories present them as unreliable narrators. They've got vested interests. There's the politics of remembering itself and why people say certain things, and the kind of paybacks, the kind of the hiding that occurs, the rewriting of history, as you say, to sort of make it more sort of pleasant or palatable, or to intensify it where perhaps it was far gentler. I mean, all these things can be put in, and the story then becomes more alive. It's more like a river. It's not still, and that was really important to me. I wanted people to feel when they read the book as if the book itself and what you're reading was alive. I mean, obviously there's critical information, there's historical text. It can't be non-stop that way, but I did want people to feel almost as if they were entering into a movie or an experiential thing of their own memory in terms of growing up and falling in love with music, experimenting with drugs, falling in love itself, the texture of the times, all kinds of things. Like I hope that people wouldn't just kind of receive it mentally, they would actually feel it inside them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that actually gets me to my next question, which is about the ethical side of things, because I think, there is, it's one of the things that goes with celebrity. And again, it's something that, Nick has written about in heaps of his songs and so on. And he's very conscious of that. But the idea that you become a celebrity and you're a bit of a cardboard cutout for people. And, and my feeling with Nick is that you and I certainly experienced this when I wrote my piece a year or so ago. And there were people coming out of the woodwork who had these incredibly strong opinions about him one way or the other. And I sort of see that as, I see him as a kind of, a celebrity as a sort of site for projection of people's various hopes, and, all sorts of mirrorings are going on. But I was surprised by the intensity of that on the whole spectrum of responses to him. So I think it's kind of interesting to have like the shimmering surface of, that water image rather than that mobile image, rather than a fixed mirror to capture all of that.
Nick's he's a complicated guy, like he's an extremely intelligent, extremely talented artist. We know that, but and he's been a polarizing figure from early on. So it's not just a matter, I think, of his celebrity, although that just becomes another part of it. And for sure, people seem to either love or hate him. Yeah. And that created difficulties for me in terms of just process. People seem to want to know whether I was totally on Nick's side or whether I was going to reveal the real Nick and, like basically knife him. And there seemed to be no understanding that I might wish to walk a middle ground that was a little cooler and appreciate the man and his work, but be realistic about faults and incorporate criticism. That seemed to be almost impossible for people to conceive of. And so the process of interviewing could be, or just getting interviews at times with some people could be kind of difficult and even a little insulting in terms of how they seem to kind of move that projection onto me as Nick's biographer. But, you know, I just kind of had to, you know, accept that and continue trying to do the work that I was doing. I think, gee, you know, it's. I mean, Nick's kind of created it for sure, and has always been creating a kind of persona or a series of personas for himself across time as an artist, which is why sometimes you hear this kind of stupid criticism that Nick's a fake, as if performing himself therefore means that there's not sincerity behind it. But you may as well say we're all fakes. I mean, here we are all on Zoom, and afterwards we'll all go onto Facebook. And that itself will be a kind of fragmentary or minor performance. Does that make everyone here a fake? I don't think so. I mean, we perform all the time in our day-to-day lives. Nick happens to have a much larger stage, and the art of music and writing, etc., through the language of those forms through which to perform himself. So it's still tethered to who he is. And in a way also too, it's either about Nick exorcising the darkness of himself, or, as the case may be, seeking to create a kind of light force or image through which he can improve himself. And again, this is something that all artists do, and to some extent, these are sort of the wishes and secrets that we tangle with in our day-to-day lives as well. And I just wanted all those sort of those shadows and those glimmers in there working. And, you know, in a way, I would hope you would finish the book and sort of see Nick from a whole bunch of different angles. You know, it's probably pretty much a journey from light into darkness, because he's a sweet young country boy, and then he gets into a darker place. But even then, the framing of it in a more contemporary way suggests that other things have happened along the journey.
Absolutely. And I think that I really agree with you. And even just the conversation that we were having before about writing poetry, and the fact that I think we're in a bit of a culture that thinks whenever you use the I in your work, whether it be a poem or a song, you know, that is a statement, that is an authentic statement of yourself. But we were just talking about that thing of, you know, some pieces don't really fit the pattern of the poem, so they're not in there. Or maybe another piece comes in because that makes the poem. But I think there's a bit of a sense that there is the true Mark or the true Nick, you know, behind that text. And I think that's a bit limiting. And I think especially when someone is so consciously putting on all of that different, you know, mimicking the different artists that he encountered as a very young musician, costumery, playfulness, taking on those very arch and ironic and mocking, you know, and also the humour, I think, is part of all of that. So a very clear kind of putting on of different costumery, I guess.
Yeah, well, he was obviously in Boy on Fire. I'm dealing with someone very young. I'm dealing with Nick as a boy and as a teenager. In fact, by the time Nick is into his teenage years and the boys next door have formed and they're eating up all their influences at just an absolute rate of knots, I would forget, even as the author, how young they were. Like they were just basically still getting out of their teens, and yet every month feels like a year. They're just soaking up influences from art, from film, from music, from each other. I was going to say like vampires, so there's a bit of that for sure. Yeah. But they're eating up things, and I would wish that maybe I had been a bit more emphatic in the later stages of the book, just to remind people that the people that you're reading about, Nick, Bill Calvert, Mick Harvey, Tracy Pugh, Roland S. Howard, and all the people around them as well, they're still teenagers, you know. When the book ends, Nick has just turned 21.
Yeah.
Right. So, you know, they're still just kids. You know, it's hard to believe it, but this, in a lot of respects. But of course, they're much more than that. You know, there's a demonic side flowering, and they're about to all those influences are about to sort of seed into something much more potent and powerful. So you're poised on the cusp of that sort of transformation.
But I think you do capture that. There's a great moment. One of the most bracing moments for me in remembering that was, you know, sort of quite late in the book. So, you know, 4/5 of the way through, and there's all of this, you know, lots of drugs and, you know, that kind of various people, you know, spitting on stages and various things are happening. It's kind of getting a bit dark. And then you suddenly reveal that actually Nick's, I hadn't really thought about this, but he's still living at home with his mother. And fortunately, I was very pleased to know that she was one of the earlier adopters of the dishwasher. And I just thought that was just really nicely done, because it's just this delicate little just reminder that this was the context of Nick Cave, which of course wasn't, as you say in the book, was not the context for some of the other people.
No, his friends were mystified. You know, how come Nick's still at home with his mum? And the answer's pretty obvious, because he had it pretty good at home with
pretty wonderful woman.
You know, yeah, she was fantastic. You know, Dawn, I spoke to many times. She only died recently, sadly, and she was always fantastic to talk to. And I think Nick inherited a lot of his literary interests and his humour, which is marked, and a lot of the sort of tenderness and kindness that you see in his sort of present day incarnation through the Red Hand files. I feel a lot of that flows, you know, directly from his mother. Yeah. Yeah,
and that's a whole other project. I actually kind of reminded myself in this conversation not to veer too much to that end of the spectrum, but it is so interesting to think about how he has reinvented himself numerous ways since the end of this book. But I think it's there is so much in this, you know, relatively short section of his life that's so rich and so telling about Australia and the arts in Australia, and about family relationships in Australia, and a whole lot of things like that are just sort of circling around. So I guess, I mean, I know that I think I sent you this quote earlier, and I'll just read this out, but the idea about secrets and privacy, which I guess is a kind of concern, and this is the question of ethics of biography. I really like Janet Malcolm's book on Sylvia Plath, where she reads all of the other biographies and tries to sort of figure out what she can actually make of all of those conflicting views, which in some ways is a kind of the opposite of the project that you're doing, where I think there's something very empathic about the way you just allow those views to sit there, and you don't necessarily you're not imposing a constant commentary on them, but then you just pop in where you need to with that element of commentary, which I think is a really nice balance. But anyway, Janet Malcolm, of course, was trying to evaluate, you know, which of these incredibly polarized biographies actually contained something that we might think of as the real Sylvia Plath. But she has this great line about biography where she says, I'll just read this bit. Biography is the medium through which the remaining secrets of the famous dead are taken from them and dumped in full view of the world. The biographer at work, indeed, is like the professional burglar, breaking into a house, riffling through certain drawers that he has reason to think contain the jewellery and money, and triumphantly bearing his loot away. The voyeurism and busybodyism that impel writers and readers of biography alike are obscured by an apparatus of scholarship designed to give the whole enterprise an appearance of bank-like blandness and solidity. The transgressive nature of biography is rarely acknowledged, but it is the only explanation for biography's status as a popular genre. A kind of collusion exists between the subject and the biographer in an the reader and the biographer in an excitingly forbidden undertaking, tiptoeing down the corridor together to stand in front of the bedroom door and try to peep through the keyhole. So from that slightly contentious thing, I mean, I think Janet Malcolm just really gets at some of those issues around privacy, secrecy, and a kind of a voyeurism that does drive some people would bring to reading your book, you know, wanting to know the Nick Cave secrets. So I'm wondering.
Transgression, that's a good word.
What was that?
Transgression.
Absolutely.
To transgress.
Yeah.
But a biographer also can celebrate a person. Biography doesn't have to be pathography.
Absolutely.
And I mean, you know, perhaps the first sort of notorious pathographic, if that's even a word, biography might have been, I don't know, the Albert Goldman one about tearing John Lennon to pieces. I think certainly what you see happening in the biographical process is something that I joked with Nick about in the early stages. And I said to him, you know, all biography as romances and then as bosses. And was talking about the relationship between the biographer and the subject. Ho, ho, ho. And yeah, and we definitely kind of traverse that path to some extent. I mean, everything's kind of cool now, so that's good. But a biographer cannot aim to please their subject, because that is fatally disempowering to your mission. Nor, I believe, should your mission be one of assassination, because that's a kind of resentment mission that comes from basically, I think, just jealousy by wanting to be your subject. I think there's as best you can, you have to try and maintain a level of kind of common sense sort of detachment. I mean, I talk about some of this in the opening, the difficulty of involvement and detachment, because of course when you've interviewed someone 20 times, you get to know them, and it's like a working friendship, basically. That's more what occurs, and everything starts to get cloudy no matter what kind of rules and regulations you set before yourself. And Nick's a very charming, smart, funny guy. He's a good guy. So your perspective on the ideas, these concepts of coolness and detachment disappear in your personal relations. But then, of course, you come to the page or the screen, and that is where the writer becomes quite a hard, cold person. And there's a danger in that, you know, it's the Graham Greene thing, the chip of ice in the heart. You have to be careful that the natural intensity of writing, the sort of going to the truth, and the sort of and just something like descriptive thrills that writing itself contains as a seductive force, doesn't distort a kind of more profound emotional truth that you need to convey, and a sort of emotional fairness. I think a few times you've sort of been talking about biography and I guess degrees of sort of moral and aesthetic danger within it. And one of the areas where I think that problems occur is not so much with your main subject, but all the subjects around your main subject who are at risk of becoming collateral damage to the gravity of the central subject, and having their stories funneled in to the centre, which in this case is Nick. And that was more problematic to me, because not all those people are public figures, right? Not all those figures are used to the degree of focus that Nick is used to, and they're getting much less airtime. So the complexity of who and what they are then and who and what they are now more so is difficult to strike fairly. And, you know, there's probably about 20 roughly main kind of characters, if I can call them characters, in Boy on Fire, 20 main people. But even saying the word characters as a Freudian slip indicates the sort of novelistic sense that I had of things. That's a lot of people to manage. It's a lot of people to make memorable, because to make people memorable, you have to give them strong quotes, strong descriptions, sharp edges. They have to stay in the reader's mind. They have to be able to appear at page 20 and appear at page 60, and you haven't forgotten them. So the sharpness of the portraiture itself can create sort of moral and emotional problems in the way a person might feel about themselves. So there's all these kind of competing kind of needs and forces. And for sure, that was that's still the area that I worry about most. the effect on other people outside of Nick. And, you know, I wanted nonetheless to recall and remember all these people, because a lot of these people that are described and get a voice in the book are people that are sort of left out of the story, and the story becomes just about Nick. And we see the past in terms of Nick. But of course, with the Boys Next Door, Nick was a major part of the band, but he was part of a very important group of artistic people and a very important larger artistic scene where people felt justifiably that they were all equals. Now they're not given that equality, and I wanted to sort of bring that history back into the frame, and Nick is the star of the story, yes, but a much wider kind of scope.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I think that, you know, the Janet Malcolm statement is an extreme that she came to because of the frustration. And of course, she was talking about Sylvia Plath, who couldn't be interviewed by anybody. So it's very different. And, you know, there's an enormous amount of, you know, those projections and investments and cover-ups and so on in the way that her story is told. But thinking about those characters or those other people, I think one person who comes alive in a really, really important way and has really kind of illuminated a lot for me thinking about Nick Cave is Colin Cave. And I think the way you depict that, the formative tension between the two of them is fascinating. So you know, they're just I think keeping that in balance must have been, again, quite a difficult one. So, but you really do have, there really is a portrait of Colin Cave as an individual with his own artistic hopes, some of which succeeded and some of which I think arguably didn't. And then the question of generational change around how households functioned in a different generation, you know, all of those sorts of things. And I think that there's a kind of a beautiful delicacy in with which you evoke that, but just again without sort of imposing a kind of a judgment, without imposing a frame around it that tells the reader to look at it in a particular way. So I think you're very sensitive to all of those nuances. But Colin Cave emerges as a really fascinating person and fascinating father for this precocious young boy, the very young Nick.
Yeah, well, I mean, Nick has written about his father on a number of occasions. Colin Cave was a very powerful, dynamic figure. If his son wasn't Nick Cave, we would probably remember Colin Cave, at lower levels of history as quite a major figure. You know, he had a transformative effect on education and in particular adult education in the state of Victoria. He was a defining force over the way we look and interpret the Ned Kelly story. He ran a symposium in Wangaratta that the historian Manning Clark and Ian Jones, who wrote the most important biography on Ned Kelly. I think it's always Ian Jones, forgotten. Anyway, the main sort of Ned Kelly biography, and acknowledged Colin Cave in the acknowledgements to that, which then, of course, influenced Peter Carey's book, The True History of the Kelly Gang, which had Nick's son playing the role, I think, of Dan Kelly. I'm trying to remember now. So there's all these wheels within wheels as well there. But Colin Cave, so Colin Cave has a formative role in our historical mythology and how we kind of view it. That was a big influence on his son. Colin Cave was also a well-regarded theatre director in both community theatre and the Malvern Theatre in Melbourne. I think that theatricality really is what gave Nick a taste and a sense that he could perform himself in public and how to perform in public and the nature of performing. You know, Colin Cave introduced Nick to many kind of novels as well as Shakespeare. You know, the Nabokov examples, the kind of more notorious one that Nick has written about. So he was an amazing guy. And at the same time, you feel shadows about Colin Cave and who he was. Like there's such a dynamism to Colin Cave there's an element of domination in his energy, and yet also incredible creativity and incredible achievement. And obviously that has fed into Nick, undoubtedly. So he is very much his father and his mother's son, and they were key people. And again, I just don't think you can. You know, I really, at the moment, we seem to love going back into the past and judging people, you know? Like as if we know how we would be in these, 50, 100 years ago. I mean, the arrogance of that is just, unbelievable to me, and repugnant, So I think, again, my job was to bring Colin Cave out of all the different ways people spoke about him, positive and negative, and use that sort of kaleidoscope of conversations and the research I had around his achievements. And again, as best I could, try to make him come alive. And for people who aren't aware listening, Colin Cave was killed in a terrible car crash when Nick was only just had turned 21. And that was probably really the major kind of life-turning crisis for Nick that shaped everything that was to come from the moment he left Australia and the birthday party came into being.
And it's interesting that you were talking before about pattern making, and I think there's just some wonderful moments where you're sort of weaving the fabric, and then there's just like a little moment that pops out, and you just identify it as being one of the kind of patterns through Nick's creative life and personal life, I guess. And one of those is about partnerships, working in partnership. So obviously, if you're in a band, it's collaborative. But in particular, there seem to be these, from very early on, these partnerships, quite intense partnerships. And obviously some of those are his romantic partnerships. And I guess that it goes on into the future to be more so. But working with, in particular, one other person and sparking off them. And that does seem to be, and I just wonder about it seems as though that might be connected with that tension, because a lot of those early partnerships have that ambivalence, bit of competitiveness and a bit of, aggressiveness to them. But I'm wondering what you see over the whole scope of Nick Cave's life and career as the most productive of those creative partnerships. And I know that the answer is probably Warren Ellis, but I'm just wondering what your take on that is.
No, that Warren Ellis now, and for at least the last decade, Nick and Warren have produced masterful albums, incredible film soundtracks. But I think most people who are fans of Nick are very divided between either loving the Nick Cave and Mick Harvey era, or the Nick Cave and Warren Ellis era. And Mick Harvey had sort of formed the Boys Next Door, was part of that schoolboy band prior to Nick even joining. And then sort of Nick rolls up, I think in second year or whatever it is, and they're just mucking around really. But the partnership that Nick Cave and Mick Harvey formed went on for decades. And I find Mick Harvey a particularly interesting figure because he seems to have this alchemical kind of impact on people. Like my favourite PJ Harvey albums are, stories of is it Stories of the City and the Sea? I'm having a mental block, and and there's a couple of others Mick Harvey has worked on. He's worked with the Cruel Sea, he's worked with all kinds of people. And when Mick Harvey is with people, he seems to bring out their very best. But I think naturally after 3-4 decades, the partnership ran thin, and that was when Warren Ellis sort of moved into the sort of situation. So I would rate it, very equally, if not perhaps slightly more in Mick Harvey's favour, only because there's more years and more of a body of work there. But I think Nick and Warren have got plenty of petrol in their tank and plenty to explore yet. And then there are these sort of other kinds of relationships, like Nick's creative tension, and they're almost like love affairs, like his relationship with Roland S. Howard as a as a sort of guitarist, and the way Roland S. Howard's songwriting drove Nick, because when Roland S. Howard joined the Boys Next Door and had left his own band, the Young Charlatans, he had Shivers on hand, which really launched Nick's career. It made Nick, a lot of people don't know still that that's actually a Roland S. Howard song. And, you know, the sound of Roland S. Howard's guitar was a kind of trademark to what became the Birthday Party. And then, you know, the friendship with Tracy Pugh, who was like a kind of dark guardian angel and delinquent friend, and Tracy Pugh's bass guitar, which was the sort of dark heart and pulse, the blood pulse of the Birthday Party sound, and the whole Melbourne kind of swamp gothic thing. That's Tracy Pugh's pulsing weight, you know. And Phil Calvert, I mean, you know, incredible drummer. Like, that's like not only through sort of the power of his strumming, but the influence of James Brown, of jazz, and, you know, I mean, it's kind of mine that and Nick seems to have drawn those people all his life, or made use of people and been aware of their talent and given them the space. And it continues on, and you see it when Blixa Bargeld joins the Bad Seeds. You see it in a phenomenal drummer like Thomas Weidler, who is so creative and again sort of jazzy in his approach to playing. Nick always brings people to him that offer him a chemistry to make something bigger.
And you see that in the sort of more cameo kind of sense, I guess, with all of those famous duets. The PJ Harvey duet being probably the most famous, but maybe the Kylie Minogue one or whatever. That's a sort of a smaller. That's the same thing on a smaller canvas, you know, drawing together quite different sorts of, you know, creative modes, and putting them in conversation with one another. Something else that I just want to ask you about, one more quick question, and then I know that we have a couple of questions from people in the audience, so I'll pass back over to Emma Kate in a moment. But I just also wanted to say that there's something that I use a lot when I'm in my writing workshops and I'm talking to students about journals and so on. Nick Cave's amazing journals, and one of the things that I really love and I often show students is his word collecting, and it does seem as though that's something that he did from, as you say, from a very young age. But, you know, really a very unusual thing for somebody to do, I think, just to have that kind of sense of the visceral response that you can have to a word, and that really kind of intuitive sense of the power of a single word. And there's some beautiful evocation of that, I think, in the work. And I think that's very important to the songwriting. But I love those just lists of all of these words, and you look at them and you think, well, no one's ever going to use those words in a song, but he does. And he has these songs that are so unafraid of allusions to all of those things that you talked about before, philosophy and art and other artists and literature, and, you know, like incredible, like polysyllabic rhymes, you know, rhyming Nabokov with whatever else it is, I can't remember in that song, but, you know, just all of that elusiveness. And there seems to me to be something incredibly unafraid about just bringing in the eclecticism of all of that, and just really having that passion for words, that very unabashed passion for words. And I just wondered if you had anything to say about that aspect of things.
Well, the sort of diary stuff or the journaling stuff that a lot of people have seen probably comes through the 80s, and when he was working on And the Ass Saw the Angel, and he was particularly there was almost a fetishistic thing had developed by that stage. But you're right, like you see in Boy on Fire that Nick was interested in language from a very early age, and in the particular power of the placing of a word. And it may have been a more kind of informal or colloquial word as much as a polysyllabic one. And in fact, I think he was interested in both the coarse and the sophisticated, the high and the low. So, you know, Nick's coming from a very educated, very good, middle-class Melbourne family, father, a teacher, English teacher, theatre director with a passion for classical music, mother sort of trained in violin, a librarian, you know, a person who could sort of sit and talk to you about sort of T.S. Eliot or Auden. So he's got all those influences, and yet he's really loving, you know, the Ramones and Alice Cooper and all these kind of things. And he starts to get into blues and folk music, particularly blues, and the sort of the murderous, primitive kind of quality to it that is in its own way a kind of precursor to a lot of what is sort of comes through hip hop now. And there's a real darkness there and a real sense of the street in it. And Nick, you know, in his passion for juxtaposition, which he talks about, the sort of combining of these sort of two forces is how he kind of creates energy. It's like nitroglycerin, you know, like you can pull words together and have them kind of explode off one another. And Nick is really good at that, and he's always really liked it. I do think, again, something's changed in the last couple of records, particularly Ghostine. He's moving into that sense of contrast is still present in his lyric writing, but it seems sort of freer somehow, or more unconscious. But I mean, knowing Nick, I think that he works pretty hard on his writing, but he's tried to move away from narrative, and I don't know. It's moving into an inner world, and I feel he's letting control go at times in order to sort of free up the writing so that the listener can float, and that meaning itself as a kind of absolute thing delivered is not the only thing that interests him, that he's looking at a kind of a more associative relationship through his lyric writing that allows listeners to sort of float in more. It's probably an example might be the difference between, you know, really great figurative painting and abstract expressionism. That's the kind of shift that I see in the way Nick works as a songwriter, and the present compared to the past in a fairly sort of simplistic terms.
And there's also that incredibly powerful minimalism that I think, you know, as a younger poet or songwriter, you know, you do kind of perhaps gravitate more towards some of the other stuff. But just in a line on a line on Ghostine, as simple as "I am here and you are where you are," which couldn't be less adorned. There's no pyrotechnics, no illusion. It's just the very sparest. And I think there's something paradoxically incredibly powerful about that kind of lyricism in amongst all of those abstract pops of imagery and illusion and so on.
Yeah, it's painful to hear a lyric like that.
Yeah,
we all know what happened to Nick and the loss of his son. Yeah. That is painful to hear, but also beautiful.
Well, it's very empathic and consoling, I think.
It's truthful, isn't it? You know, this is the thing, truthful.
So on that note, I think we should go back to Emma Kate and the questions that have come in from audience members.
Yeah, thanks, Felicity. Jacqueline has asked Mark, in the interest of emotional fairness, what is one misconception about Nick that you wanted to set straight in the book?
I don't know if I felt I had a mission to set anything straight. I wanted to not reduce Nick. I think, I mean, it wasn't so much me, but just the way Nick talks, you get a pretty good sense that he's funny, that he's a humorous person. That's come out more in the last couple of years, but I like that there's that comic sensibility there. And I guess too, maybe in a larger sense, that there is the conversation around Nick as this sort of dark, satanic, you know, the heroin prince, all those kind of things, which were very dominant when I began the project and have obviously changed very much in the wake of the tragedy around Nick and the way he's sort of come out online and the way he writes. There's a whole different kind of thing going on. But I guess I wanted to sort of show that there was a much more complicated and feeling and basically decent person in there as well, and that you just couldn't kind of reduce him down to one thing or the other. You know, I mean, you can find lots of terrible things about Nick and his history and lots of beautiful things, which is much how we all are, really. Thank
you. And Dennis has asked, he said, I'm wondering, were there any real surprises that Mark uncovered through his research? And if there were, how did you deal with the emotions of these?
Yeah, there were. Yeah. I mean, there were surprises. Real surprises might be, there are a couple of things. I mean, and it becomes, I mean, you don't have to tell every part of the story. You can suggest things. I think if you read my biography, there are elements to what I almost reveal that I don't feel I can say outright. So, you know, you walk a kind of tight line sometimes between the truth and the truth not being a brutal, careless instrument, but one which you kind of need to take a kind of step back from, but which at the same time, with respect to the story and to the truth itself, is something you somehow need to sort of let out. So that becomes a really, like it's a strange balancing act, and you're almost operating like the way a crime writer operates, where you drop a clue without letting people know where that clue might lead 100%, but people are kind of free to interpret those things as they wish.
Thank you. Mark, thank you so much for tonight's discussion. Felicity, thank you so much for your great questions. As those are all the questions that we've had through, I might hand back to you both for any final comments or last questions that you would like to make, Felicity, before we wrap up for the evening, because we do only have a few minutes left, unfortunately.
No, I'd just love to just say again, just congratulate Mark and say that I didn't really know exactly what to expect from this book, but I have been completely absorbed in it, and I think that there are so many, you know, it actually takes you down so many different pathways. So I'd say most people would be reading it and going and listening to various things that they haven't listened to for a while, maybe following up some of the other characters and so on. And most of all, I think I hate to put this pressure on you, Mark, but also looking forward to what might come next beyond it. I know you have just published this book, so that's probably very unfair, but yeah, so yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Felicity. Thanks, Emma, Kate, and avid reader as well. Everybody for tuning in. You know, when I kind of began the project and what's come of it, the thing I saw it as a biography of a great artist, not just a rock and roll biography, but the rock and roll part obviously matters in terms of energy. And I really like the idea of it fitting beside biographies of like Brett Whiteley and Germaine Greer and you know, the Les Murray and whoever, so that there was a sense of it being about a great Australian artist, and that Australian thing is really important, and that you get a big kind of narrative about growing up as an artist in Australia across the decades that I mapped. So even if you're not into Nick or you hate him, there's value in it. But yeah, thanks everybody for tuning in and taking the time to listen to me rave on, and hopefully you'll enjoy the book. I'm proud of it. I really am.
Yeah, thank you. Everybody for attending as well. I have posted the link that you can use to purchase your copies of Boy on Fire if you haven't already. I've shared it again in the chat box there. Mark and Felicity, thanks again so much for tonight's discussion. I'm going to give you the opportunity to take yourselves off mute if you wish to do so, everybody, so that you can join me in thanking Mark and Felicity for tonight's discussion. So you should be able to take yourselves off now if you would like to do so.
Thanks, Mark. Love it.
Thank you.
Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely rest of the night.
Yeah.